After years of war, all Josh wanted was peace. But it vanished when two stunning alien women began to seduce him, each hiding secrets, each playing a dangerous game. What he thought was a fierce, sensual desire was a trap, because behind their beauty lies a cosmic mystery, and Josh is the key.
Earth had long since ceased to be the universe's epicenter in the year 2102. It had changed into something different, something much more intricate and remarkable. Earth was no longer merely a place where people lived. It was now a hub, a portal where species from other galaxies came together, exchanged goods and services, dreamed and fell in love. The stars in the night sky were now neighbors rather than far-off dreams. Now aliens were colleagues, rivals, and co-workers rather than invaders or mystery, and occasionally heart-related issues. Emotions were still the one thing no one had fully understood in this weird new age, where cultures were blending and technology made it harder to distinguish between biology and machine. As it happened, love was more intricate than quantum code. Josh Phillip used to be the epitome of strength and determination, a name whispered reverently across a dozen planets. A cosmic marine, a hero born of war. He had survived all of the conflicts he had witnessed, which were so fierce that they warped reality. His war, however, was now done. Josh was exhausted, worn out, and weighed down by memories more than any armor he had ever worn. He just wanted to be at peace. His final mission was to be alone. He therefore brought only old scars and a wish to blend in when he moved to a peaceful interplanetary neighborhood tucked away on the outskirts of New Tokyo's orbital extension. His rehabilitation was aided by distance, coffee, and quiet. However, much like conflict, peace can appear when you least expect it. It began quietly. There was a knock on the door that continued a little too long. The recycled air conveyed the smell of an unknown perfume. Strangely frequent mechanical breakdowns that always came at the right moment to drag him out of his haven. Then she appeared, Katri, a hauntingly beautiful Barus, her skin a gentle, glistening blue like sunset over quiet water. Her eyes were deep pools of violet that appeared to know more than they should, and her silver hair fell like stardust. She grinned as though she knew all the secrets and was never in a hurry to share them. She always showed up when the quiet became too comfortable, usually with a gentle question or a cunning plea for assistance. She was elegance and curiosity wrapped in charm. There was a fuse that needed to be fixed, a gadget that ignited at the perfect time, a meal recommendation that wasn't actually a recommendation. The storm then arrived. In every aspect, Sulik was the complete opposite. Sulik charged like a storm front, while Katri moved like a mystery. Her green skin was glowing against a mop of scarlet hair, and she was a Zork with sharper contours and edges. Her humor was dry, her meaning was obvious, and her stare was fire. Sulik said, where Katri whispered. Sulik promised where Katri had suggested. She was proud, fierce, and unvarnished, and she wore her history like armor. She didn't knock. Sometimes literally, but always without apology, she bounded in. She wasn't playing a covert game with Josh. It was a territorial declaration. What about her competition with Katri? Tension that could pierce steel, cold smiles, and hotter looks. Instead of using weapons, they waged their fight using looks, gestures, and the unstated challenge of winning the heart of a man who was desperately attempting to feel nothing at all. Despite his tactical genius, Josh was initially unaware. Confidential reports, encrypted conversations with a corporation, and the long, silent agony of someone who has witnessed too much were all buried deep in his psyche. When Katri laughed, he ignored the warmth that was building. Every time Sulik approached too closely, he brushed off the pounding in his chest. He attributed it all to closeness, biological misfires, and the perk of residing in an area where instincts, pheromones, and emotions intertwined in novel and peculiar ways. However, feelings don't wait for approval. Sometimes they come in the shape of silent challenges, while other times they come in the form of shared silences. Josh started to pay attention. Everything, not just them. Katri's habit of knowing more than she admitted. Sulik's hasty reaction to information she shouldn't have had. Trends became apparent. Whispered words that didn't make sense until someone else said them. Even when he wasn't sharing his reports, people kept looking at them for too long. There was a rhythm to the flirtation, but underneath it pumped a darker melody. It was more than romanticism. There was more than simply tension. Something else was present. Something concealed in those late-night meetings' silent nooks. When Katri and Sulik believed he wasn't looking, a question that lingered in the air and neither of them dared to ask danced behind their eyes. Josh was mature enough to see when something didn't make sense. He has fought wars on less than a gut feeling. His instincts were now resurfacing, but this time they were due to fresh uncertainty rather than previous trauma. It seemed like Katri was always in the right place at the right moment, but why? For what reason did Sulik inquire about the corporation in a way that no civilian should be able to? Why, just when one of his confidential signals came close, was it that caused the interference? It was more than a simple love triangle. It was far more risky. A riddle disguised as emotion. A cross-species, cross-intention game. Even though Josh was exhausted, he was once more in the middle of something he didn't select but might not be able to leave. Not now. Because firearms aren't always used in warfare. Some are battled in silence, with secrets. And with the kind of love that requires more than just survival. It requires the truth. The truth. There was always a price for it. In silence at times. In blood sometimes. No one was more aware of that than Josh. On battles light years beyond Earth, he had witnessed truth being perverted. He has witnessed truths destroy whole coalitions and lies create heroes. Truth, when it did come to light, rarely provided tranquility, which is why he now kept his distance. However, there was a hint that he wouldn't be able to avoid it this time because of something about the neighborhood, something that existed between the walls of his peaceful apartment and the low hum of intergalactic engines passing overhead. He was the first to notice the little things. There was a tool on the table that he was positive he hadn't used. He had a marked as read mail in his secure inbox, but he hadn't accessed it. The slight hint of smell in the air following Katri's visit, or was it Sulik? He occasionally couldn't determine which echoes belonged to whom because they both left them behind. Or perhaps that was the idea. The inquiries followed, seemingly benign yet tinged with malice. One day, Katri inquired about a planet that was hidden by a security code that most people wouldn't even be aware existed. It was one of Sulik's scathing little jabs about a business endeavor that was still encrypted at level 4. Josh sensed the change even though they both dismissed it with charm and deceit, felt the weight of what they had to say. I sensed that people were observing him with fascination as much as yearning. He started his house's silent diagnostics, firewalls, signal trackers, surveillance traps intended to detect any illegal scans. Everything first came back clear. However, he discovered it one evening following an odd static problem that occurred during a standard system upgrade. An alien data signature contained in a diagnostic tool he hadn't used in weeks was a trace fragment. The installation was done by hand, locally, by someone who had been inside. And that's where I want to pull you in for a moment. Imagine you're Josh. You've buried your past, isolated yourself, and now, someone has entered your sanctuary not through force but precision. A data signature, a quiet breach. No broken doors, just broken trust. What would you do if someone you were starting to care about turned out to be spying on you? Let me know in the comments. Would you confront them, cut them off, or would you dig deeper like Josh, chasing the truth no matter the cost? And if you're enjoying the unraveling of this mystery, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. There's so much more to uncover. Now back to the story. That night he didn't sleep. He chose to sit in his living room's dim light and gaze at the stars through the panoramic glass wall instead. Like silent ghost ships floated by. When he stared out there, he used to experience awe, pride, and longing. All he could feel now was the icy grip of remembrance, the burden of outdated orders, the echoes of operations in which betrayal always came with a kind face and trust had been used as a weapon. It was no longer merely a game. Katri's persistent looks, Sulik's audacious smiles. They weren't making out. They were doing calculations. Not always. No, there was something genuine there as well, something complex and perplexing. But data was being collected under the heat. An observation, manipulation. Though maybe intended to divert his attention, the romantic tension was genuine enough to be felt. Why was the question? Josh began to reorganize his files one by one. The reports he got, not the ones he distributed. Patterns started to emerge. A failed deep space reconnaissance mission is mentioned. There are rumors of an old artifact that has been lost and that is not fully understood. A weapon. Okay. He now suspected that the corporation's own logs were purposefully ambiguous. However, the commander of the mission had disappeared. Josh was the final person to debrief him prior to the disappearance. At the time, it had no significance. Another handshake, another face, another data transfer. Now, though, he started to question whether the encounter had been more than a formality given Katri's fresh looks and Sulik's lighthearted jokes. Perhaps there was someone who thought he had retained some of it for himself, and it's possible that they sent two pairs of eyes to see what he knew. The worst thing? He didn't want to believe it in part. A segment that recalled how Katri's voice grew softer when she talked about the oceans of her native country. Sulik's wild and coarse laugh has the power to jolt him back from the brink of despair. More than shadows they were, more than agents. They were women with stories engraved into their skin and fire in their hearts. And yet, he had learned from the war he had fought to never believe what his own eyes could see. He hesitated though. He had experienced death more times than he could remember, so it wasn't because he was scared. However, this time, his life didn't seem to be in jeopardy. It was his spirit. He had buried it under duty, status, and etiquette, keeping it hidden for a very long time. It stirred now though. It hurt. It recalled the experience of feeling. And his heart gravitated toward the danger even while his head was screaming warnings. Into them, Katri, Sulik, two names, two forces, like twin moons with erratic gravity, two cosmos of secrets and seduction circled him. He was unsure of whom to believe, but he was aware of one thing. He was no longer able to run. Josh wasn't made to be unsure. Moments of urgency had shaped his entire career. Make a decision, take action, and live. Yet now, all of his instincts were at odds with one another. Reason required separation. Danger murmured in his gut. However, an older, more delicate, and human being yearned to remain in his exact location. Even if it meant getting burned, I yearned to feel again. He started to test the waters by remaining silent rather than asking inquiries. Through observation, he would listen to Katri talk while observing her hand movements and how her eyes would stray to his computer terminal whenever she thought he was not looking. He observed Sulik's timing, as she often showed up minutes following a high-security communication breach. How her humor sharpened when he approached some subjects too closely. However, there were times when he was totally disarmed. The night Katri unexpectedly arrived with a platter of what she described as traditional Baru's comfort food. A fragrant, steaming dish that glowed dimly. She made no request to enter. For the first time, she simply stood in the doorway feeling a little unsure. Josh had anticipated another ploy, another charm-encrusted deception. They ate in quiet instead. Don't be flirtatious. He could find no secret agenda. Two people sitting opposite from one another, attempting to recall the taste of serenity. Or the day when Sulik, who is often bold and unstoppable, appeared with a cut on her arm and tired, lifeless eyes. She had attempted to make fun of herself and laugh it off, but the pain was genuine. Without a word, Josh bandaged her, and she stayed longer than necessary, just breathing and not talking. She didn't try to woo him that evening. She simply existed next to him. And for some reason, that spoke louder than anything she ever uttered. It was more difficult at times like this. It's more difficult to remain vigilant. It's more difficult to accept that one of them was only an agent. Josh, however, had witnessed too much to disregard the warnings. People were adept at pretending to be in pain, very good at hiding poison and weakness. So he dug deeper. He used buried code from his time in black operations to access one of his old corp backdoors. Not permitted, not approved in the slightest. However, it provided him with what he required: access to private profiles, logs, loops of surveillance from service routes, landing bays, and even intergalactic customs data. His fears were not validated by what he discovered. It broke them. Katri was more than a technician from a small Barusian industry. She was accessing data well beyond civilian boundaries, even though her clearance levels had been removed 5 years prior. Her most recent listed task? An official shipment that had never arrived at its destination. Even more hazy was Sulik's track. She had an impeccable military record, too impeccable. Clint edited. There were gaps in her service details and illogical timings. Then, in a footnote of an old mission brief connected to a Zork intelligence breach, there was a name Josh hadn't heard in over 10 years. Sulik had once spoken this name in joke, but nobody outside of the Black Tier intelligence community should have known it. Both of them were lying. However, he was as well. Josh had buried his own history beneath layers of denial and formality. The task he had completed prior to his retirement, which everyone believed he left clean, had not been clean at all. An artifact had been present. An abnormality was found deep within a system that had never been explored. Something ancient, alien in origin, releasing incomprehensible patterns. He had kept what it had showed him to himself. It had muttered something. He had nearly convinced himself it had been a hallucination up to this point, a consequence of stress. of being made public. However, Katri and Sulik's presence, accuracy, and nuanced questioning all suggested the same thing. They were aware, not only about the relic but also about its potential. They weren't alone either. Josh saw that the shadows were getting closer. Not real ones, though he claimed to have seen a flicker outside the window on a few occasions that wasn't a passing ship. No, the data contained these shadows. Enter timestamps milliseconds apart in your logs. Activity from sources without an origin point on his encrypted channels. Probes, ghosts, echoes of onlookers in distant locations. He wasn't only being watched. They were hunting him. The neighborhood had shifted from being quiet and odd in a way that was almost endearing. The grins were more phony. The air was more charged. The Andrillian and her human companion across the hall abruptly disappeared, and the cafe on the corner closed early now. In passing, Katri noted that they had moved to a different orbital zone. Josh, however, saw it in her eyes. She was telling lies. Both of them were. But Josh recognized something horrifying as he gazed at the final image the artifact had projected, etched into his retina like a scar from a sun that had long since faded. He had concealed something, which is why they weren't hunting him. Something had picked him and they were hunting him. Technology was not the only artifact. It had life, or aware, or something that was more than either. And it had attached itself to him somehow. Not in a physical sense, but vigorously, as though it had recognized something valuable in him, deserving of protection, or perhaps worthwhile to test. Not because they desired him, but because they had to learn what the artifact had left behind. Katri and Sulik were now becoming too close. What it roused inside him, Josh too, was beginning to sense it as well. Dreams were the first step. Stars that flowed like wounds in dreams. Of mouthless voices. Of doors that swung open and remained open in his imagination. Dreams that were more like recollections. Yet they weren't his own. Not yet anyhow. The main passages were not taken by them. With her weapon ready and her boots heavy, Sulik led with precise, almost silent steps. Katri trailed closely behind, her body taut, one hand grazing the tiny energy-pulsing gadget at her hip. Something foreign, something predating Barusian technology. Josh shifted between them and experienced the strangest sensation. Not panic, not bewilderment, but clarity. He was well aware of what awaited them in each hallway they entered. He sensed every camera above their heads, every scanner they went by. It felt like static across his skin's edge. He had no idea why, but he felt as though he was a part of the station, not just a passenger. Interacting. Speaking at a level that was beyond the scope of his military education. Katri was the first to notice. As they traveled, she continued to stare at him, her gaze darting to him as lights went out right before they arrived at each checkpoint, as though the system was paving the way for them. Sulik saw it too, but she didn't say it out. Half a second before Josh even reached for the panel, the doors unlatched. Security barriers that were set up to require level 7 clearance just blinked once before opening without any opposition. In less than 7 minutes, they arrived in the bottom docking bay. 20 should have been enough. Sulik turned to Josh and spoke in a sharp, low voice. "What are you doing in hell?" His honest response was, "I don't know. It's simply happening." Katri moved forward and touched his shoulder tenderly. "It is the artifact. The link is being accelerated. You're merging now and not just remembering." Josh, however, was too busy to inquire what that meant, since they arrived at that time. A pattern of lights dimmed above the bay, not all at once. A cadence. It was virtually a biological pulse. On the far platform, a ship landed, silent, sleek, and more sinister than the space between stars. No insignia, no registry code, just intention and shadow. Furthermore, the figures that emerged when the hatch opened weren't military. They were different, tall, wearing armor that glistened in the sea like obsidian, faces concealed by masks that appeared to be grown rather than constructed. They moved too precisely to be human, but too smoothly to be mechanical. They remained silent. Weapons were not raised by them. They merely observed, as though they had been waiting to pass judgment rather than engage in combat. Josh's breath caught. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. He knew them somehow. It didn't matter what they were called or what species they were. However, something deep within his chest was mirrored by their presence. Something old. He had been shown symbols by the artifact. Structures. Shapes are too intricate to illustrate. He now understood, however, that these were more than just visions. They were recollections. Not in this life. Not from this body. But from another source. A figure wearing a mask moved forward, its head cocked, not violently but inquisitively, almost respectfully. The air became more dense, The area surrounding them throbbed once, resembling the rhythm of a huge, invisible heart. Josh took a stride in its direction. Then Sulik swore behind him. Katri made a move to stop him, but then she paused, her breath stuck in her throat, her hand half lifted. Because Josh's stance had shifted in some way. He straightened his back. His face fell flat. Previously a warm, war-worn gray, his eyes now softly shimmered with gold threads. He was no longer just Josh Phillip. A hand was raised by the figure. It was an acknowledgement gesture rather than a threat. Recognition. Acceptance. And something moved between them when Josh held up his hand in exchange. Not power. Not very good. Details. A deluge. A million visions roared through his head, including universes formed and wiped, civilizations that lived only long enough to dream, and wars fought in dimensions that no longer exist. He gasped and lurched back, grasping the rail behind him for support. The artifact is at the heart of it all. Not a weapon, not a tool, a seed. An intelligence older than stars, dispersed in shards throughout the universe, each one looking for, observing, and anticipating the proper host. Not merely smart, not simply deserving, but ready. Josh now got it. The fact that he was a soldier had not led to his selection, or someone who has survived. Because he was broken, he had been selected. Because you can't make something that's broken. It's real, Katri said in a barely heard whisper behind him. You're now one of them. Sulik brought her weapon up once more, but not at the black-clad figures. Josh. With a harsh voice, she said, "Don't take another step. You are still human, regardless of what you believe yourself to be. Keep it in mind." Josh gently turned to face her, and there was a brief, fleeting glimpse of something other than himself in his gaze. A shadow. It was a glimpse of something too big to fit in one guy. Then he blinked though. Then it vanished. In a quiet voice he continued, "I'm not losing myself. I'm discovering the aspect of myself that has always been absent." The figures with masks remained still. They were not obliged to. They had had enough. Josh got it. They weren't present to pick him up. They were present when he woke up, to verify the beginning of the artifact. And there was no turning back once that the integration was underway. Not for him. Not for any of them. Katri took a step forward, her eyes brimming with tears of admiration rather than fear. They are more than merely onlookers. They are remnants of who we were prior to the collapse. Sulik brought her weapon down a single inch. What are they seeking? The stars no longer appeared random as Josh glanced up toward the glass dome over the bay. Now they pulsed in a rhythm. A message. A map. His voice was remote as he stated, "They don't want anything. They're awaiting." "For what purpose?" Sulik inquired. Josh looked over at her. "For me to recall the next step." Suddenly the cosmos began to tilt, because something else was awakening someplace out there, beyond time itself, beyond the boundaries of known space. It was also anticipating his arrival. After then, time didn't act regularly. Josh was the first to perceive it, moments that were subtly but unmistakably extending, breaking, and looping back on themselves. Echoes of conversations that had not yet taken place started to play in the back of his consciousness. He saw recollections of individuals he had never met and glimpses of futures he had not experienced. It wasn't insane. Alignment was the cause. His consciousness synchronized with something that had previously been omnipresent, touching all timelines, before it broke into silence, revealing a process taking place inside of him. The figures in masks remained silent. They didn't have to. Just their existence was language, and Josh was starting to understand it. They were mouthless. No faces. However, it was hard to ignore their intents as they poured into him like gravity. Their purpose was not to take him away. They were a threshold's protectors. He was supposed to pass the boundary. Not yet though, because he was still bound to the world he knew by one last thing before that. Or maybe two. Sulik and Katri. The sound of faraway engines hummed through the walls like lullabies as he stood alone in the center of his darkened rooms. The setting crimson moon shone on Katri's silver hair as she sat in the window seat across from him, knees raised. Even though it had been minutes since she had spoken, her quiet was more powerful than words could ever be. Her voice was subdued as she eventually added, "I wasn't supposed to feel anything. You were the target, a task. However, I felt as though I had been noticed when you first gave me a genuine smile. Not the agent, not the extraterrestrial, me." Josh shut his eyes. It was more painful than he thought. It's not because of her words, but because there was a part of him that wanted to believe it with all his might, maybe the last remaining human part. Even while Sulik remained guarded, she had softened in some way as she stood at the door. Though it flickered with something softer now, her fire was still there. Grief perhaps. She avoided looking into his eyes and remarked, "You were never just a mission, but I'll stop you if this thing inside of you transforms you into something else." something that loses the ability to feel. Whatever we had in common. Not irate, Josh turned to face her. Not combative. Simply put, I'm exhausted. What happens if I develop into something more? He inquired. Not any less. Not a monster. However, someone who can at last mend the things that we all damaged. Sulik remained silent. She didn't have to. Her quiet itself was a response. More was not trusted by the universe. Far too much of it had been seen. The dream reappeared that night, but this time it was whole. It was obvious this time. He was standing on a platform that was circling an imaginary star. Fragments of cities drifted around him, cities that sung in tones of gravity and light, that remembered, that breathed. An eye opened above it all. Not exactly anatomical, no, but a conscious eye. Sympathetic, horrible. It also spoke, not in words, but in the language of crashing stars, in a pressure against his chest. The last threat is you. The words pierced his bones and he woke up gasping. Sweat adhered to his body. His room's lights flashed, according to emotion rather than movements. Something had woken up inside him, in full, irrevocably. He was no longer human in the same sense. However, he was also not human. He was somewhere in the middle, something changing. Existence itself is rewriting the code of a vessel, not machines. And the spectators, the ones without masks, have been waiting for this for their entire lives. The ship came back the next day. No armaments, no requirements, simply being there. It waited after docking. Unaware of it, the station slowed around it. Systems reacted as though they were being affected by a force that was too delicate to notice. Everything went a little out of rhythm. Everyone fell silent, disconnected, as if the cosmos were holding its breath. Katri visited him one final time. She said, "You don't have to leave." However, they were both aware it was untrue. He was gone already, long ago when the artifact touched him, prior to their meeting. This was more than a salvage mission before anyone recognized it. It had been a calling all along. He looked the same for a moment as he turned to face her. The same face, the same weary eyes, the same silent power. Now, however, there was light behind them, a depth, something that transcends space and time. He extended his hand to grasp hers. She didn't back off. He remarked, "I'll remember everything, particularly you." He then looked at Sulik. She refrained from crying. She remained still, but there was fire in her eyes once more, brighter than before. A problem, a caution, and goodbye. She said, "I'll remind you if you ever forget, with a plasma cannon if I have to." He grinned. Smiling felt fantastic. Then he got on board. After him the doors shut. The spectators bowed in respect, not in devotion, for what he now carried, not for who he was. Earth shrank behind him as the ship withdrew. Josh, however, didn't turn around, because a recollection was waiting for him to come back somewhere up ahead. A memory that is older than life itself. A fate inscribed in light rather than blood. And there is still a decision to be taken. As the future was not predetermined, it had life, and now he was too. He drifted through a corridor of stars. Not in the physical sense, he wasn't walking anymore, not even floating. He was moving, yes, but the universe didn't measure it in speed or distance now. What he experienced wasn't space as he had known it. It was something purer, stranger. It was like stepping inside the veins of existence, flowing along paths that pulsed with memory, meaning, and origin. Time bent. He saw himself as a child, but not in any Earth year. He saw his mother, but her face kept shifting, slipping between human and something else. Something that bore him not in flesh, but in purpose. These weren't hallucinations. They were threads, woven into a tapestry too vast to comprehend. A pattern that had started long before Earth had even cooled, long before life itself had named emotion. He was the memory now. The ship hummed around him like a living cathedral. It had no controls, because he was the control. The connection had solidified. Every breath, every thought, whispered instructions into the ship's systems. It responded to desire, fear, clarity. It was not a vessel for travel. It was a conduit, a bridge between what was and what was becoming. In the deepest part of that journey, somewhere between reality and myth, he heard it again. You are not a weapon. You are the door. The artifact hadn't chosen him to wield power. It had chosen him because he could let something in. And something was knocking. Back on Earth, or what remained of Earth's orbital dominion, Sulik stood in the apartment he'd left behind. Katri was sitting at the edge of the unmade bed, running her fingers across the fibers of a half-folded shirt Josh had never taken with him. It still smelled of him, and strangely of stars. I felt it when the ship jumped, Katri said quietly. Her voice barely broke the air. Something shifted. I think the universe felt it. Sulik didn't answer at first. She stood near the window, watching the small moonships curve lazily over the distant atmosphere. She was too grounded in the present to give in to mysticism. And yet, there was something inside her chest she couldn't shake, like a muscle being pulled toward a direction that didn't exist yet. He's not coming back, Sulik said finally. You don't know that. Oh, I do. Not the way he left anyway. There was a silence, but it wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken feelings, fractured trust, and something neither of them wanted to admit. They had both cared, and they had both lost. But what had they lost? A man? A friend? A version of themselves they only knew when they looked into his eyes? Maybe all of it, maybe more. Katri sighed. You know what scares me the most? Sulik didn't turn around. That we might have just witnessed the birth of a god. And we don't even know if he'll remember what it meant to be one of us. But Josh remembered. That was the point. The more he moved toward the source, the more human he became in contrast. It was paradoxical. The farther he got from Earth, the louder his humanity screamed inside him. He remembered every hand he'd held, every scream on the battlefield, every laugh, every betrayal. The smile Katri gave him under starlight, the way Sulik punched his shoulder when she was too vulnerable to speak, the quiet cup of coffee at dawn with nothing but silence and peace. He carried them all now, not as memories but as anchors. The masked beings, if they had names he hadn't earned them yet, guided him to the threshold. And there it was, the eye. Not literal, not physical, but presence. A swirling mass of energy and intelligence that defied comprehension. Time collapsed into it like petals folding inward. Galaxies drifted along its edges like pollen on wind. Josh wasn't afraid, because somehow he knew it. It was what had whispered to him in dreams. What had split the code of reality and rewritten it with empathy, not command. It was waiting for him, not to consume him, but to become with him. It offered choice. Remember, Josh, the final key is never knowledge. Swell. He stepped forward. And the moment he crossed, every particle of his being expanded outward like a nova. He became story. He became message. He became echo and origin and tomorrow. And he spoke. Back in the edge of the solar cradle, screens flickered to life. And used channels, dead frequencies, languages untranslatable suddenly became clear. And one message repeated, soft but undeniable. I remember. It came from every station, every ship, every satellite long forgotten. It etched itself into dreams, into quantum dust, into children's lullabies. Some laughed it off as glitch. Some wept. Others felt it. Katri was the first to respond. She sent no message back, just placed her hand on the window pane and whispered, I remember too. Sulik watched the sky long after Katri had left, and she finally whispered back, so do I, soldier, so do I. But the journey wasn't over, not for Josh. Because even as he merged with the cosmic stream, the pattern unfolded further. He had unlocked the first threshold. There were others, and now he could feel them, other seeds, other voices, other beings like him, caught between what they were and what they were becoming. And they were not all friendly. Some wanted to close the doors, to halt the evolution of thought, of will, of memory. They feared what Josh was becoming, because Josh represented something dangerous. Hope, not blind, not idealistic, but earned hope. Hope that had walked through blood and betrayal, through stars and solitude. Hope that didn't ignore the cost but carried it. And now that hope had wings, the ship surged forward, beyond systems, beyond time. And deep in the silence between galaxies, something stirred. A mirror waiting to be faced. Another door, another test, and maybe, just maybe, another heart still capable of love. Because even out here, in the wild threads of creation, Josh Phillip remembered, and the cosmos? It had only just begun to respond. It began with a pulse. Not light, not sound, something deeper. A tremor through the lattice of reality, as if the very blueprint of existence flinched, and then adjusted. Something had changed. Somewhere beyond where stars had names or laws held sway, a threshold was breached. Josh felt it before he saw it. The ship shuddered, not from impact but from awareness, like a living thing holding its breath. The masked figures around him, silent guides and watchers of the path, stopped mid-motion. They didn't turn. They didn't need to. Whatever awaited them ahead had been written into their purpose. But to Josh it was new and ancient, familiar like a dream too real to be fiction. He stood now on the precipice of a second doorway. The first door had awakened something in him. Not powers, not abilities, something far more terrifying. Understanding. It wasn't just memory anymore. It wasn't even memory from a single life. What flowed through him now was collective, echoes of other hosts across other epochs, fragments of civilizations that had held this role before and paid dearly. Some had passed the test. Others had become gods of war. A few had collapsed into madness, unable to reconcile what they knew with who they were. Josh now saw the cost of being the vessel, the door, the seed. And this time, the path would not be offered to him. He would have to choose it, truly choose. And the test would not come in the form of battle or revelation. It would come in the form of recognition. The next chamber wasn't a place. It was a memory, or rather, a choice rendered into space. Josh stepped forward and the stars bled away. The masked watchers receded. Even the ship withdrew from his senses like a tide pulling back, leaving him standing on the dry seabed of himself. And in the distance he saw it, a doorway. No key, no guards, just a presence, and standing before it, two silhouettes. He recognized them before his mind could even catch up. Katri, Sulik, but not as they had been, not holograms, not illusions. These were constructs of something deeper, renderings from his heart, forged by the artifact from the pieces he could not let go. They moved, breathed, spoke, not programmed, not puppets, but reflections of how he remembered them at their most real. Katri approached first, bathed in Barusian moonlight, her eyes a well of questions and empathy. You feel it now, don't you? The pull of destiny, the weight of meaning. But Josh, her voice was almost a plea. If you walk through that door, you don't just leave Earth behind. You leave yourself, the you we knew, the one we loved. Sulik stood back, arms crossed, watching silently. But her gaze, it burned. She wasn't pleading, she was judging. You want to ascend? She said, her voice sharper than ever. Then earn it. Don't hide behind visions. Don't pretend you're doing this for anyone but yourself. You want meaning? Start by facing the truth of what you're leaving behind. Josh looked at them, these echoes of his past, and for the first time he felt something crack deep within, because he couldn't deny it anymore. He missed them, not just their presence, not just the warmth of touch or sound of laughter. He missed who he had been when he was with them. A man still trying, a man still fighting to be whole. The door pulsed softly ahead, not calling, waiting. Josh took a step forward. The visions didn't stop him. Instead, they moved with him. And the moment he passed them, they merged, light into light, memory into will. And then the door opened. No hinges, no frame, just a rupture in truth. He crossed. The other side was dark, but not empty. It was saturated with presence. Josh felt it press against him, not to crush, but to read. The way a sculptor feels stone, searching for the shape inside. And then the presence spoke, not as voice, as meaning. Do you understand what you are? Josh tried to answer, but the words weren't enough. Instead, he allowed memory to speak for him. Visions of battles fought, friends buried, wounds that never healed, love that bloomed despite trauma, fear he carried like armor. The darkness accepted it and changed. Light began to rise, not blinding, gentle, revealing. The room, if it could be called that, blossomed into a sphere of time itself. Spirals of history and possibility rotated around a single point at its center. A cradle, empty, waiting for him. Josh understood. The door was not just to see the source. He was the next source. The seed had not only chosen him to unlock history, it had chosen him to create what came next. But choice remained. To step into the cradle would be to commit, to guide the next age with knowledge unbound by time, with memories that spanned the breadth of creation, but also to leave behind the life that had brought him there. He stood on the edge and thought of Katri's trembling hands, Sulik's blazing eyes, the station, the laughter, the coffee, the tension and tenderness, all the things that made him more than a soldier, more than a vessel, a man. Josh whispered one word, please. And then, impossibly, another voice answered him. Not the presence, not the watchers, a new voice, a voice from Earth, from now, Katri's, across time, across space, across the unchartable. I feel you, Josh, she whispered. Wherever you are, we're still with you. The cradle shimmered, because the last test was not to let go. It was to bring them with him, not in body, but in heart, in memory, in intention. He stepped into the cradle, and the universe exhaled. In the black beyond, where stars are born in silence, a new pattern unfurled. It was not language, not prophecy. It was presence. Josh Phillip, warrior, lover, survivor, now a thread in the loom of reality itself. And with his arrival, a signal went out, not one to control, but to invite. Across galaxies, other seeds stirred. Other doors began to awaken, each one with a question burning in its core. Will you carry the memory forward? And in the heartbeat between that question and its answer, the future began. And somewhere, on a moonlit veranda above a sleepy orbital colony, a small flower bloomed in a pot Josh had left behind. It glowed faintly, unnaturally, a gift from the ship, a sign. Katri found it the next morning, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled, because somewhere out there among the stars, he was still remembering her, and he always would. Josh wasn't the only one to awaken something greater within. Somewhere else in the galaxy, a super soldier trained by the human empire rebelled. Imprisoned, forgotten, until he was freed by the leader of the rebel resistance. Now he fights against the very ones who created him. If you thought Josh's story was intense, the next one will shatter your view of the empire. Click now and meet the traitor who became the greatest threat to human domination.